Hey everybody, it's Halloween! So I thought, what better video to do to celebrate Halloween than a Castlevania Top 10? But not only is this a fun video to do for Halloween, 2011 marks the 25th anniversary to the Castlevania franchise. And the Castlevania series also happens to be one of my favorite video game series of all time. Well, it seems about time to kick this video into gear. Let's begin the Game Pow Top 10 Castlevania games! Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, is the very first Castlevania game I'd ever played. Even though when I was a kid, I could never get past the Clock Tower or the Forest stage, it was still my favorite game. Castlevania 3 brought a really cool addition to the series, and that was the ability to be able to switch characters. Trevor Belmont wasn't alone in his quest to defeat Dracula. After meeting an ally, with a simple push of the select button, you could switch to a new character. First, there's Grant the Nasty, who has the ability to hang onto walls, and he's really good with a knife. And the witch, Sifa Belnadis, who in the American instruction booklet was said to be a dude. And then finally, there's Dracula's son Alucard, who has the ability to fire fireballs out of his cape and turn into a bat. Castlevania 3 is one of those games I just love to pop in every now and then, and I never get tired of playing it. It's fun, it has great music, and a badass intro. As much as I love this game, a lot of the Castlevanias that came after this I consider to be better. So I'm sorry, my good friend Castlevania 3, but as much as I love you, you're at number 10. Number 9 is Dracula X for the Super Nintendo. Dracula X seems to get a lot of hate because people say it's a fake Rondo of Blood. And that kind of sucks, because it's not a bad game. I mean, sure, it's not the greatest game in the series, of course, since I put it at number 9, but this game is still a lot of fun. I also think it has some really lush, vibrant backgrounds, and the game has some really great looking sprites. Hell, when I was a kid, I thought this was a prequel to Symphony of the Night. I'd never heard of Rondo of Blood. One thing about this game is it is extremely hard. It is old school game wanting to kick you in the balls hard. And Rondo of Blood's final boss ain't got nothing on Dracula X's final boss. Seriously, Dracula is hard on this game. Overall though, this is really one of those games I want to put in when I want to get my ass kicked by a game. And I've still never beaten it without cheating. Dracula X also has an arranged composition of Rondo of Blood soundtrack. And it's kind of weird, but for a few of the tracks, I like them more on the Super NES. So as I said before, it's kind of sad that people hate on this game, because it's not a bad game at all. So there it is, Dracula X at number 9. At number 8, we have Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth for the Nintendo Wii. Rebirth is based off of Castlevania Adventure for the Nintendo Game Boy. One reason I love this game so much is because it's so great to be able to play an old school Castlevania, but remade for a newer system. This is one of my favorite downloadable games of all time. The game's not that long, it takes about an hour to beat, but man is it fun. Also, they do justice for Christopher Belmont, because I didn't really enjoy either of the Game Boy games too much. The game's graphical style really reminded me of a Game Boy Advance game. But that's okay, because I think this game looks great for what it's trying to achieve. And Rebirth also has some really cool boss battles. There are also keys hidden in different areas that let you open up branching paths. And that of course helps out for replayability for all those people that just want to find every single path there is. And just as almost all Castlevania games, Rebirth has a great soundtrack. I mean, like a kick-ass soundtrack. See, that's the thing. I think a lot of games need more songs like that, games that make you feel like a real badass. So now we leave Castlevania Rebirth and we move on to number 7. Number 7 is Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. This is one of the many Castlevania games that have the Metroid style inspired gameplay. And while it's not the best of all of them, it's still a really great game. One thing I really love about this game is it felt like what at the time was old mixed with new. What I mean is that this was the Metroid style gameplay that the Castlevania series was going for, but you played as a Belmont. So it still had the RPG elements, such as leveling up and customizing your equipment, but being a Belmont, your main weapon is always the Vampire Killer. The cool thing is that you can equip the Vampire Killer with different elemental attributes. The funny thing about the story of this game is Juiced Belmont doesn't really search for Dracula's castle, he kind of accidentally stumbles onto it. But he still fulfills his duties in slaying Dracula. Well, sort of. I'm not going to spoil the story for you. You have to play it to see for yourself. But this is a really cool game, and if you have a Game Boy Advance, you definitely shouldn't miss it. The thing that should have been cool, but I didn't really find very cool myself, were the two different castles. This game's got one of those dark world, light world kind of things. And while that's necessarily not bad, I just don't really want to explore the same castle over again. I mean, sure, you get to fight new enemies and everything, but overall I didn't enjoy it as much as I did the other games in the series. And while the music is really good, it's not the series' best. But anyway, it's time to move on to number 6. At number 6, we have Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo. A lot of people might be disappointed to see that Super Castlevania 4 is so far down my list. But that's not really a bad thing, because all the games on this list are great games. Super Castlevania 4 is actually a remake of the first Castlevania. You once again get to take on the role of Simon Belmont. Castlevania's coolest feature is the ability to swing your whip in 8 different directions. And trust me, this is an awesome feature. And just like many other Super Nintendo games at the time, Super Castlevania 4's got some Mode 7 for you. Another new feature was the ability to dangle your whip around. Personally, I didn't find much use for this though, mostly because your attacks are a lot weaker when you're dangling your whip like that. This game also had a lot of parts where they had you swinging across platforms just like Indiana Jones. One thing about this game that's so great is just how great the controls are. It makes this game feel perfectly smooth, and if you mess up, it's your own fault, not the game's. And Super Castlevania 4 has got some really great music in it. I'll probably end up saying that about all these games though. Just as I said earlier though, just because this game's at number 6 doesn't mean it's a bad game at all. This game is great. The game's also got amazing level design and some crazy boss battles. But now it's time for us to move on to number 5. Number 5 is Castlevania Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis. One thing that really sets Castlevania Bloodlines apart from the others is that you get to choose your character. You get to choose John Morris, who's more of a traditional character. He uses the Vampire Killer. Or you can choose Eric Lacard, who uses a spear. Even though both characters are cool, I've always enjoyed playing more as Eric Lacard. The coolest thing about Eric Lacard is that he can use his spear to attack in 8 different directions. But he can also use his spear to jump to hard to reach locations. Castlevania Bloodlines is the only Castlevania to be released on the Sega Genesis, but man is this game great. But Bloodlines is also pretty hard. They've got some really crazy stuff going on in this game. And this game's got some crazy boss battles. Just about every stage has you fighting a mid-boss as well as a stage boss. Not to mention that I personally think this is one of the best looking games on the Genesis. All the sprites look great, and tons of the enemies have epic deaths. Castlevania Bloodlines is not only one of my favorite Sega Genesis games, but it's also in my top 5 of Castlevania games. It's funny because when I think Sega Genesis, I think this game. But guess what? This game also has a great soundtrack. If you for some reason missed Castlevania Bloodlines, then it's time for you to go track it down and play it. But as for now, it's time for this top 10 to move into number 4. Number 4 is Castlevania Portrait of Ruin for the Nintendo DS. Portrait of Ruin was the reason I bought my Nintendo DS. Placing these last top 4 on this list were really hard just because I love all 4 of these games. Portrait of Ruin is actually a sequel to Castlevania Bloodlines. Just as Bloodlines, you get to control 2 characters. You get to control Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Owland. The coolest thing is being able to use both characters to solve puzzles. Portrait of Ruin continues the Metroid-style gameplay, but in addition to exploring the castle, there's also portraits. The portraits take you to different themed worlds. Sorry I couldn't get any footage of the worlds, but it was kind of hard just to get this footage on my computer. But trust me, this game is huge! And not to mention, after you beat the game, you get to play through the entire game as Richter and Maria from Rondo of Blood. But I definitely have to say, one of my favorite parts about this game was the story. I loved getting to find out what happened with John Morris and Eric Lecard after Bloodlines was over. Another thing is, unlike his father, Jonathan Morris can't use the Vampire Killer, so you get to use things like swords and axes and other weapons like that. And then you'll learn lots of magic spells with Charlotte. But now it's time for us to move on from Portrait of Ruin on to number 3. Number 3 is Castlevania Aria of Sorrow for the Game Boy Advance. One really cool thing about Aria of Sorrow is it takes place in the year 2035. Now, while that doesn't really change the castle too much, it does make for an awesome story. The game's main character is Soma Cruz, and he has the power of dominance. Pretty much what that means is instead of getting your normal set of sub-weapons, such as a knife, axe, and holy water, you can collect the souls of your enemies. So just for an example, let's say an enemy throws spears. You'll have the ability to throw spears after you've taken their soul. Aria of Sorrow is another one of the Metroidvania style games. And trust me, it was really hard for me to pick these last top 3 games. As this game is so good, it could be the number 1 Castlevania game in someone's list. After all, the gameplay is excellent, the soundtrack is amazing, and the game even has a new Game Plus feature. Plus, when you beat the game, there's another mode called Julius Mode. In Julius Mode, you get to play as Julius Belmont. This game's also got some insane boss battles. Of all the Metroidvania style games, I think this castle is my favorite. But now it's time to move on to number 2. At number 2, we have Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine CD as well as the Wii Virtual Console. Now I know they made a remake of this game for the PSP, but this game was already perfect. As good as the PSP version is, the original is better. Rondo of Blood is definitely the best of the old school Castlevania games. And what I mean by old school is before the series switched to the Metroidvania style of gameplay. Rondo of Blood's coolest feature are all the alternate stages. All throughout the game there are tons of alternate routes to take. Trying to find them all just adds to the replayability. Another cool feature is the ability to play as Maria Renard. Maria and Richter play completely different, as Maria throws doves and Richter uses his whip. But Maria can also slide on her belly as well as double jump. And then there's the game's soundtrack. This game's soundtrack is awesome. It has some of the best music in the entire Castlevania series. Another cool thing about Rondo of Blood are the bosses. After you've beaten them, they always try to take one more strike at you before they die. So every boss in the game has an epic death. Choosing this game for number 2 was really hard just because it's such a great game. And for a lot of people, this is their favorite Castlevania of all time. But now, it's time to move on to number 1. My number 1 favorite Castlevania game of all time is Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation 1. Not only is this my favorite Castlevania game, but this is also one of my favorite games of all time. Symphony of the Night was the very first Castlevania game to use the Metroidvania style of gameplay. And man, did it do such a great job. This game has some of the best sprites of all of the Castlevania games. Alucard is probably the best looking sprite in the entire series. All of the enemies look great and have great death animations, and every part of the castle is just filled with detail. And they did a great job of making each part of the castle very unique. None of the environments get repetitive at all. And then this game has some of the best bosses of any 2D platformer. Now the enemy death animations are one thing, but the boss death animations are a completely different story. epic. And then there's Symphony of the Night's brilliant soundtrack. I definitely have to consider this one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. I've lost count of how many times I've played through this game. And the biggest thing about the game is once you think you've beaten it, the castle flips upside down and you start all over again. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a masterpiece. And it's my #1 pick for the top Castlevania game of all time. The only thing I'm wondering is when am I going to get another good Castlevania game, because I hated Lords of Shadow. But that's another story for another day. So thanks for watching this Castlevania Top 10, and please subscribe.